Turn that on. All right, am I on? All right, great. Well, it's very good to be with you tonight. I always look forward to coming and being with you, and appreciate again the invitation to speak. And I've said it before, but I want to say it again. I really appreciate and want to thank you for all that you do for the Southeast Institute of Biblical Studies. You have been very generous with your money. You've been very generous, at least from what you've told me, with your prayers, and I think that's borne out in the success that we've had. And I appreciate many of you individually who have taken an interest in the school. And we could ask for no better friend than this congregation. And I really mean that and appreciate you all for that. And it's good to see several of you. Didn't know Ethan Bell enjoyed my preaching as much as he does. And the Watkins, boy, people are just coming from all over the place just to hear me preach, I'm sure. But it's good to see some Carnes members, and the Del Montes are here, who are, I hate to call them former Carnes members, but I guess that's what they are now. But a lot of good people, and then two of my favorite preachers work for you all as well, in Brother Allen and Brother Lipe, so it's good to see them. But let's get to Matthew chapter 5 and setting the bar high. It's a phrase in the English language, to set the bar high or set the bar higher, and apparently it originated in the 1950s. There's a long-standing event in the Olympics. In fact, this event goes all the way back to ancient Greece, when the Olympics were held there, but it's called the pole vault. And up until the 1950s, the pole vault, the height of the bar was kind of capped. It had topped out, not so much because of what the human body was capable of, but because of what a pole was capable of. Poles were either made out of aluminum or bamboo up until that point. And just for the record, I'm not a pole vaulter. So if I get a little bit of information on pole vaulting wrong, please forgive me. My high school had pole vaulting up until about the 1970s, long before I got there. But then there was some sort of accident with one of the pole vaulters. So when I got there, there was no more pole vaulting. But one of the problems with pole vaulting is that with aluminum or bamboo poles, there was a weight issue when the pole got to a certain length, and there was a strength issue when the pole got to a certain length, because the pole would break, and that could be very dangerous for the person who was pole vaulting. But what a pole vaulter does is he takes that pole and he holds it, and that pole sticks out ahead of him, and he runs a distance toward this bar that's elevated quite a bit above the ground. And when he gets close to that bar, he sticks the other end of the pole in the ground, and he uses his momentum and the leverage from the pole to vault himself over that bar. Well, up until the 1950s, the height of that bar had been capped. But then in the 1950s, they started making poles out of composite materials, which allowed the pole to be longer because it could be stronger, and it allowed the pole to be lighter because of the material. And so it didn't weigh down the man as he was running. And, we've got all sorts of Carnes members just coming in here. I did not realize I was that popular. Don't anybody tell me any different, by the way. I'm just going to live in my dream world that so many people really enjoy my preaching. But anyway, it's good to see the additional Carnes members that are pulling in. Because of the longer pole and the greater durability of it, or the greater strength of it, and the lighter pole, now all of a sudden, what appeared to be sort of the maximum that humanity was capable of as far as the high jump, the pole vault goes, now all of a sudden record kept getting broken and broken again and broken again and broken again. In fact, a new world record was set just last April in the pole vault. And so it just keeps getting higher and higher. But the phrase, set the bar high, was coined in the 50s when all these records started getting broken again. And so they would say, set the bar higher. And then the next guy would come along and he would say, set the bar higher. And now what it means in the English language, simply put, is a representation of setting a high standard for performance in a particular field. And when we read Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, we see an incredibly high standard for, if you will, performance, if you'll allow me to use that word, but an incredibly high standard for performance in the field of religion and spirituality. Whereas our society, or maybe even us at times, want to set the bar low, Jesus says, no, the bar is high. If we were to boil down Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7, into a nutshell, we would just simply say it's about how to get into the kingdom, and then it's about what the expectations are once you're in the kingdom. If you go back to Matthew chapter 4, Jesus is preaching, and he's saying, just like John the Baptist was in his preaching, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And 3 years or so after Jesus preaches this sermon in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, the kingdom's going to show up. And this is Jesus basically making a big statement at the beginning of his ministry. Here's what the kingdom that you've been looking forward to, here's what the kingdom is going to look like. And here's what the expectations are. And the first 20 verses are just packed with so much stuff because this is the introduction to the sermon. Just like all sermons have introductions, and then they have bodies, and they have conclusions, this is the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. And in the first 12 verses, he talks about, here's what you have to do to get into the kingdom, to become a citizen of the kingdom. And then in verses 13 through 20, he says, once you're in the kingdom, here's what you're expected to do. And then he spends the rest of the sermon after verse 20, from verse 21 all the way to the end of chapter 7, expounding upon these 8 verses in Matthew 5, 13 through 20. And so he says in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 13, here's what I expect you to do once you're in the kingdom. Here's where the bar is set. He says, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Do not think that I came to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle of the law will pass away until all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you, and this may be the key verse in all the Sermon on the Mount, for I say to you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter into the kingdom of heaven. You see, that last statement would have probably shocked every single listener of this sermon. Because in the minds of the Jews and in the minds of the Pharisees and the scribes themselves, they were the pinnacle of being a Jew. They were the pinnacle of obedience to God. They were the pinnacle of spirituality. They were the high bar. And Jesus says in verse 20, no, they're the low bar. You have to exceed that bar if you want to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And so right there, he sets the bar incredibly high. And so when we look at Matthew chapter 5, we can see two ways in which Jesus sets the bar high. The first way is the bar is set high for evangelism in verses 13 through 16. Once again, he says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is good for nothing except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." Salt, even in our day and age, is a very valuable commodity. It's probably used by all cultures, all societies in our world today. Certainly in ancient times, it was incredibly valuable. Salt was used primarily, and still can be, for three purposes. One, to season food. You don't like the taste of your food, if it's a little bland, you put some salt on it. And they did that even in the first century in Palestine. A second purpose was for preservation. Palestine, it's hot most of the time anyway, and they didn't have refrigerators and ice boxes and things of that nature. And they certainly didn't have all the preservatives and chemicals that we find in the most delicious of foods today that we would eat at McDonald's or whatever. And so one of the ways that they would make food last longer is they would pack it in salt, use salt as a preservative. And a third primary purpose as well of salt was medicinal. If you have a wound that might get infected, if you put salt on it, that will help keep the infection at bay. In fact, help kill the infection. The phrase "rub salt in the wound," that is not a good thing, at least in the way we mean it. But when you do rub salt in a wound, it may hurt, but it'll keep it from getting infected. And the ancients knew this. People in the first century knew this. And I don't know that Jesus is trying to pinpoint one particular way, but the point is this: whatever you use salt for, what does it do? It changes, it affects whatever it touches. So if you put salt on a piece of food, it's going to change how that food tastes. You put salt on a piece of food that might be soon to spoil, and it's going to change what that food or the longevity of that food. You put salt on a wound that might get infected, it's going to change that wound. And that's the whole point here. Salt influences and changes whatever it touches. But see, if salt loses its ability to do that, then what good is it? It's just sand, more or less, if you will, at that point. If salt doesn't flavor food, we're not going to put it on our food, right? We're not going to buy something that doesn't do anything. We're not going to buy it if it doesn't help preserve the food. We're not going to use it if it doesn't help us medicinally. If it does nothing, we're not going to buy it. And if we have it in our house, we're going to throw it out. What do you do if you see sand in your house? What do? You vacuum it up or you sweep it up, right? And then you throw it in the trash can. Well, here's Jesus' point here. As Christians, we should affect or we should change whatever situation or whatever area we're introduced into. If there's a Christian in a community, that Christian ought to be influencing the community and not the other way around. That's the point. But Jesus continues with another illustration here. He says, "You're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." A city set on a hill, especially in the first century, was very important. A city set on a hill was like a beacon that drew people. I grew up in a small town, even smaller than this, and we would go to, if you will, the big city to do our shopping, sometimes to go to the doctor and those kinds of things. That's what a city set on a hill did. It drew people to it. Why? Well, because if you're a farmer, you go to the city set on a hill because you're going to sell your stuff. Or maybe you need some of the amenities that the big city provides, or what have you. And we're supposed to be lights in that way. Light draws people. If people are in the dark, what do they grope for? They grope for the light. They're looking for the light. And then he goes on to say, you don't light a lamp and then cover it up. That wouldn't make any sense either. If you have a flashlight and you're camping and you want to see where you're going, you don't turn the flashlight on and then put your hand over the end. That doesn't accomplish the purpose. But as a Christian, what should we be doing? We should be drawing people to us or to the kingdom. But what else should we be doing? We should be illuminating the darkness that surrounds people, the spiritual darkness that surrounds people in our world. And so the expectation, the bar that Jesus has set, is for those who are citizens in His kingdom to bring others into the kingdom. Jesus, if you'll allow this tongue-in-cheek political illustration, Jesus wants immigration. He wants mass immigration into His kingdom. Now, there's some stipulations to that, obviously, but it's our job to go out and introduce to people how they can be a part of the kingdom and bring them in, to be the salt that influences the world around us, to be the city that draws people to us, to be the light that illuminates the darkness. Israel, the Jews, were supposed to do this. They were supposed to be a light to the nations. In Isaiah 49 and verse 6, God says, is it too small a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel? I will also make you a light of the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. The Jews weren't supposed to just take their knowledge of God and keep it to themselves and kind of cloister up in their own little land of Israel and just stay there, kind of almost like hermits. The idea, one of the main reasons why God gave them the law and gave them the understanding of God that He did, was so that they could communicate it to everybody else in the world as well, and so that the Gentiles, they would be a light that would draw the Gentiles to God and help them understand what God expected of them. The problem was the Jews never really were concerned about doing that, and when it got to the first century, to Jesus' day, it was as bad as it had ever been. And the scribes and the Pharisees that Jesus calls out here were some of the worst offenders at it all. They cared nothing for the salvation of the Gentiles, and they cared nothing for the spiritual welfare of even their fellow Jews. They just cared about themselves. In Matthew 23 and verse 15, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves." The Pharisees would go around and make proselytes or converts, but not for the purpose of showing them the way, not for the purpose of saving them, just for the purpose of having bragging rights and having an additional follower or something like that. And they would make him twice as bad as they were. They would corrupt him with their improper teachings about God and make him twice as bad as they were. But instead, Jesus says in verse 16, if you're going to be in my kingdom, the bar's not just down here where you're only concerned about your own spiritual welfare. The bar's not down here where you get to just keep the truth to yourself like the scribes and Pharisees did. The bar's up here. You're expected to let your light so shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Peter says something very similar in 1 Peter 2 and verse 12. He says, keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, the non-Christians, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, as they observe your good behavior, glorify God in the day of visitation. And this phrase, glorify God, is a wonderful phrase that many in the religious world misunderstand today. When we think of glorify God, oftentimes we think of somebody standing there and maybe looking up into heaven and saying, praise God, or something like that, or maybe singing a song in praise to God. And that would certainly fall into it, but that's not really what the Bible is talking about when it's talking about glorifying God, especially here in Matthew 5:16 and 1 Peter 2 and verse 12. In these two verses especially, the idea is that Christians should behave and act, be salt and light in their community, to the point that non-Christians will see that, be attracted to that, want to know about that, and then be taught that, so that then they become Christians, and then at that point they can look up and they can glorify God, not just saying some generic praise God, but glorify God because of the salvation that He has blessed them with. See, that when you have a person, for those of us who grew up in Christian homes like I did, we may have a tendency to take this for granted because we never really know anything different. But for the person who grew up not in a Christian home, who grew up being taught, at least religiously, things that were not true, who then finds the truth, when they find the truth and they obey it, they lay hold of it, they look up at God and they are incredibly thankful because they realize where they were and they realize where they are now. And they glorify God because of His grace and His blessing of allowing them to be saved. And Jesus has set the bar high for you and me to bring others into His kingdom. And the question is, what are we doing to be salt and light? I'm not saying we're not doing anything, but as individuals, we really need to do a self-assessment about what we are doing. You see, if you will, in a sense, we're all individual grains of salt, or individual rays, or beams or particles of light, if you will. And are we, as that grain of salt, are we influencing or changing the community that we're touching? Maybe in the next few days, do this little exercise. Take a piece of paper out and a pen and say, how am I being salt in my neighborhood? And list the things you're doing. And you may list a number of things, and that's wonderful if you are. You may list nothing or somewhere in between, but either way, you can see what you're doing and what you should be doing. And I can do the same. See, when I go to work, if I work secularly, but if I worked secularly, when I go to work and I see employee Jim over there, what am I doing to influence employee Jim to become a Christian? What am I doing to illuminate the darkness that he's in? What am I doing to be the city that's set on a hill that's drawing him to the kingdom? Or my neighbor Susie, what am I doing so that she can glorify God? See, Jesus didn't set the bar to just be a good person. He didn't set the bar to just know the truth, make sure I've got this attendance thing at church down, that I'm taking the Lord's Supper, that I'm not, smoking, drinking, doing drugs, killing anybody, the big things. And he didn't set the bar to just be a good guy. He didn't set a bar to just, show people by my quote-unquote example. Because there's a lot of good examples in this world. The bar's not set that low. The bar's set higher. The bar's set for me to actively do something, to be salt. Salt, if you will, actively changes the environment it's in. It says something. It says something about Jesus to people. It helps them understand the situation, the sinful situation they're in, and how to fix it. Light does the same thing. If they're walking in darkness, the bar's set to get rid of the darkness so that they clearly understand where they are in their relationship to God. The bar is set high for evangelism. But secondly, the bar is set for righteousness. Look in verse 17. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle will pass away from the law until all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever does them and teaches them, he shall be called great in heaven. For I say to you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will in no way enter into the kingdom of heaven. You see, Jesus here is addressing the charge that he at least anticipates, if it hadn't already been made against him, that he's just coming to take the old law, wad it up, and throw it in the trash. You see, the Jews revered the old law. The scribes and Pharisees revered the old law, and that's a good thing. They needed to revere it. They just didn't revere it in the right way. But Jesus makes it very clear, I did not come to take the old law and abolish it. I came to fulfill it. And that word fulfill is a major word in the book of Matthew. Matthew peppers his gospel with that word fulfill. And what it means is to bring something to completion or to its designed end. And so Jesus is saying the old law has an end. But it's an end that was designed by God, and Jesus is the end of it. You see, the whole old law points to Jesus. All the prophecies in the old law, and this is why Matthew uses the word so often, is he's showing that in Jesus the old law is fulfilled through His death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. It's brought to its designed end. And Jesus is saying, contrary to what people say, not only am I not here to abolish it, I'm here to keep the whole thing until it is fulfilled, until it's brought to its designed end. To use an illustration, most of us in here probably went to elementary school and junior high school and then high school, maybe all of us, or are in the process of doing that. When we did that and when we graduated from high school, once we got that diploma, what did we do? Well, we might have done a number of different things, but we didn't go back to class, at that high school anyway. We might have gone to college, we might have gone to trade school, we might have gone to work, we might have just bummed around or something like that and slept in for a while in our parents' home, I don't know. But we didn't go back to high school. Why? Because there was a designed end to high school. And once we reached that designed end, high school no longer had any authority over us. Paul says it in this way in Galatians 3:24 and 25. Therefore the law has become our tutor, our high school, if you'll allow the term, to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith comes, we're no longer under a tutor. Now that we've graduated, we don't need the tutor anymore because we've already passed that class, if you'll pardon the expression. But the point here is Jesus holds so much reverence for the law that He's saying we need to follow all of it without exception until the time I bring it to fulfillment. Well, the Pharisees and scribes, they revered the old law, but just really more so in principle and not so much in practice. And so what they would do is they would rank all the commands in the law, and they would say these are really important, these are lesser important, and the ones that they felt were really important they would keep, and the ones that they felt weren't so important they would break. They wouldn't worry about it very much at all. And sometimes they even practiced and taught that some commands didn't even have to be followed. In Matthew 23, verses 16 through 22, Jesus points this out to them and says, well, you guys say that whoever swears by the temple, he doesn't have to keep that promise. But if he swears by the gold of the temple, now that's a promise you have to keep. Or whoever swears by the altar, you don't have to keep that promise. But if you swear by the horns of the altar, yeah, you got to keep that one. Well, that doesn't make any sense, but that's the Pharisees saying, well, this command doesn't have to be followed in this situation. In fact, in Matthew 23 and verse 23, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin." You're so concerned about your tithing that you'll even tithe out your spices, but you ignore the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy, and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You see, the Pharisees' approach was, these are the ones I've got to keep, these are the ones I can get by without keeping. And sometimes they even flipped it around so that the lesser commands were greater than the greater commands. And Jesus is saying, no, that's not how it works. You can't annul even the least of the commands and expect to get into heaven. You can't teach somebody else that you can annul or eradicate even the least of the commands and expect to get into heaven. You see, the level of righteousness of the Pharisees and scribes was really partial obedience to God's laws. That's where the bar had been set by them. But Jesus has set the bar high for you and for me, much higher than that. And we're to obey all of God's commandments and to teach others to do the same. Now, we don't follow the old law anymore, because it's been fulfilled in the purpose of Jesus Christ. And since we've graduated from that school, according to Galatians 3, we don't need to go back to that school. But we do have a law we follow, and that's called the New Testament. And just because Jesus is saying here, and just because we preach that we have to obey all of God's laws, doesn't mean we're saying that we earn our salvation. Far from it. Jesus isn't saying that, and I'm not saying that, and I know Brother Allen and Brother Lipe wouldn't say that. In fact, probably no one here would say that, but that's certainly not what I'm saying. And I'm certainly not saying, and Jesus is not saying, that it has to be perfect law-keeping, because all have sinned, Romans 3:23, and fallen short of the glory of God. So what is Jesus saying here? Well, he's talking about an attitude and a disposition of holding in reverence the entire law of God. Everything that God says to do, whether I think it's important or not, I'm going to do my dead level best to obey. And if we do this, if we do our best to keep all of God's commandments without disregarding any, then we'll be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And if we teach others to do the same, we'll be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Toward the end of the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 7:21 through 23, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' And I will say to them, or declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" In other words, depart from me, you who haven't obeyed all the commandments that I've given. And so what's our attitude and disposition toward God's Word? You see, the Pharisees set the bar very low. We're going to keep the ones we think are important and not keep the ones, or not worry about the ones we think are unimportant. And we think, boy, I can't believe that they would do that and think that, because most, if not all of us here would say, you know, I really try to keep all the commandments, and we probably all do. But without realizing it, we may in practice do the same thing that the Pharisees did. You know, we may say, well, I don't murder anybody. But then when we get outside the four walls of the church building, our speech may not be quite what God expects it to be. You know, the bar's high. Now, we may say, well, that's not that big a deal. In fact, we may even use the phrase, well, it's not like I killed anybody, right? But see, it's not just murder that's important. It's our speech that's important too. We might say, well, faithfulness to our spouse, that's essential. You got to have that. You got to do that. And if somebody doesn't do that, we may shake our head and just be so disappointed, and we should be disappointed. But we may at the same time say, well, that church attendance thing, that's not that big a deal. You know, if I've got something else going on, like a sporting activity or hunting or camping or, fill in the blank, that's okay. Homosexuality, that's flat out wrong. You can't do that, right? But immodesty, that's okay. I mean, after all, it's hard to find stuff that's modest in the clothing stores. And I don't want to stick out like a sore thumb because I'm dressed differently than everybody else. Well, abortion, that's a sin. Abortion is wrong. But the gossip I engage in, God doesn't really care about that. The little lies I tell, on my tax return or to my boss or to my spouse or whatever the case may be, that's not really that big a deal because after all, nobody's getting hurt by what I'm doing. You see how sometimes we can, without really even realizing it, fall into that same trap that the Pharisees fell into. And really oftentimes for you and for me, it comes down to which sins I think are a big deal and which sins I think aren't a big deal, right? And you know what the difference is? The sins I commit, those aren't a big deal. The sins you commit, those are awful and wrong, and you guys need to stop them right now. How dare you? But see, that's the game we play without really realizing it. The things I do, those are totally understandable, and I should be given a pass. But the things you do are a different story. Am I offering an invitation or just, okay. Maybe you do know, but I'm going to tell you least ways. But I looked up the world record for pole vaulting. Now, if God had said, or Jesus had said in the Sermon on the Mount, Will, you have to pole vault to be a part of the kingdom. And if you just would have put a period there, I'm out. It's not going to happen. He could have laid a stick on the ground and said, pole vault over the stick on the ground. It's not going to happen. I tried to pole vault as a kid over a stick on the ground. It didn't end well, and at 49 years old, after back surgery, it probably would end even worse. The world record for pole vaulting is almost 20 and a half feet. There is a guy, I think he's Swedish, if I remember correctly, but he's not American anyway. But there's a bar in April that was set at 20.4555 feet. They did it in meters, but that's what the conversion was. And that man took a long pole, ran toward the bar, stuck it in the ground, and he, without touching the pole, or without touching the bar, went over that. That bar's set way too high for me. For anybody in here, because he's the world record holder. He's the best at it. So by definition, none of us can do that. You know what the nice thing about the bar is that Jesus has set for us? It's high. It's high. No doubt about that. He set a high bar for evangelism. He set a high bar for obedience to all of His laws. The nice thing about it, though, is every single person in this room can clear that bar. It's a high bar, but we can clear it. Now, it may require some effort. In fact, it will require effort. It will require some energy. It will require some sweat and some toil. It will require some sacrifice. I'm going to have to give up a few things in order to clear that bar. But I can clear it, and you can clear it. Brethren, in the first 12 verses, Jesus tells us how to be a part of the kingdom. And then in verses 13 through 20, He tells us very clearly what He expects of us as citizens in the kingdom. The bar's been set for us to evangelize and bring others into the kingdom, and the bar's been set for us to obey all of His commandments. And let's do our dead level best to clear that high bar, because you and I, we can all do it. Thank you very much.